Today we're going to be assembling a Perkins 4108, and as you can see, there's the cylinder block. Everything's been cleaned and disassembled, and right now we're getting ready to put the main bearings in, so we will do that now. You want to clean this surface here and also the back of the main bearing, make sure there's no oil residue on it, and then you can insert it into the block by putting it in there and then pushing down on it until it's flush with the block. As you can see, there's a notch on the main bearing that lines up with the notch marked out in the block. So you put your three main bearings in. And next we will put the crankshaft inside the block. Next you want to put oil on the main bearings. Make sure they're lubricated before you lay the crankshaft in there. And next we will take the crankshaft. All the journals have been cleaned and polished, and it's ready to be assembled inside the engine block. So you'll take the crank, I'm going to lower this in, and then I'll get the film back on the engine. You want to be very careful lowering the crank into the bearings. You want to be gentle, you don't want to scratch the bearings at all. Lay the crank in the block. Make sure when you lay it in that the crank journals don't have the oil hole up top. You don't want the oil hole up top, because next we're going to check the clearance with plastic gauge. Okay, we left off, we were going to check our clearance on our main bearings. This is the plastic gauge that you can get from just a local auto dealer, Advanced Auto or Napa, something like that. This one, the sealed power, it's 1 to 3 thousandths is what you're going to be measuring, and the clearance for these main bearings, it calls for 1 thousandths. And what you do is, it's just a little green strip inside the plastic gauge cover. You cut small pieces and lay them on the main bearing journals, just like that. Next we're going to install the main bearing caps with the bearings in them, which will be these here. Bearings already installed those same ways we did in the block. Next we're going to be bolting these on, torquing them specs, and then checking the clearance. Okay, I've torqued all the main bearing journals down to specified torque, which on this is 80 foot-pounds. If you can look at that spot on the crankshaft journal, that's your plastic gauge that got compressed, and you want to take the plastic gauge measuring tool. See if I can get this in here and show you exactly what to do. There's different clearances on the plastic gauge. 1 to 3 thousandths. You want this to fall between 1 and 3. And this one, as you can see, is about 2 thousandths. So we're good there. And you want to check each journal, each main journal. And you're going to do the same thing to the rod bearing journals also. Sometimes the plastic gauge will be on the journal. Sometimes it'll end up on the bearing, like it is here. Just go ahead and measure that. Make sure it falls within your specifications. Next, once you've checked your main bearing clearance, make sure you install your end plate thrust washers on your back bearing cap and in the block. That's for your end plate of your crankshaft. Next, you want to check your crankshaft end plate. Let's get a feeler gauge, insert it between the crankshaft flange and the main bearing cap bolt, where you installed the end thrust washer. This one has 5 thousandths clearance, and they give you a maximum of 20 thousandths end plate. That's well within specs. And the crankshaft should spin freely once assembled in the block. Next, you want to remove your crankshaft seal, end seal, and install with a new one. Okay, the rear main bearing seal, rope seal, you should call it, has been installed. Just here, you have 2 halves, one there and one at the bottom. That's been installed. And next, we will put the new pistons on the rods. Make sure you check your piston skirt to cylinder wall clearance. Slide your piston down, slide your cylinder, and take a feeler gauge and measure the distance between the skirt and the cylinder. Check for the size that they recommend or the clearance they recommend, and just take a feeler gauge and place it between the piston skirt and the cylinder. If you want to check your ring end gap clearance, take one of your new piston rings, and you're going to install it inside of the cylinder and check the ring end gap clearance. Try and get it so you can see the markings on this ring, but it's not focusing. Anyways, you will have some markings on the rings. When you install these on the pistons, make sure they're facing upwards. Any markings, could be a dot, and like I said, just make sure they're installed facing up. So you'll take your piston ring, install it into your cylinder. Once you install it into your cylinder, get it started, and then take your piston and install the ring down into the cylinder. This will keep your ring square so you can check your ring end gap. So once your ring is inside the cylinder, you will be checking that small gap right there. Take a feeler gauge, measure it, make sure it's within specs. I recommend doing that with each ring and each cylinder, make sure they all fit correctly. Next, we're going to remove the pistons, the old pistons off the rods, off the connecting rods. there's a clip that holds the piston onto the connecting rod. You have to remove this clip here, and then you can remove the piston off the connecting rod. When you position this clip back on, make sure it's at 12 and 6 o'clock. You don't want it at 3 or 9 o'clock. It can sometimes compress this ring under running conditions, and have the clip will pop out, and then the piston pin will slide out, and you'll have problems that you don't want. Anyways, position this clip, the opening vertical, not horizontal. I'll show you what it looks like when I'm done. Alright, this is how the piston should be mounted on the rod. That is the position of the clip when it's installed. Vertically installed, not horizontal. And that's it. We'll continue in a moment. Alright, next you're going to want to ring the piston. Put the rings on the piston. I've installed all of them except for the top groove. There are ring installers if you want to get a ring installer. I don't personally like them. I just like going and installing the ring by hand. But you want to be careful because they are brittle. So just get it started on one side and work it around. It's much easier with two hands, of course. And just slowly slide the ring down. It will crack. Try not to dig it into the piston when you're moving it downward.
This is Todd Ulrich. They'll tell you they sell timeshares, but what they're really selling, you don't want to buy.
Slowly bring it down so it's in its groove like that. Once it's in the groove, you have all your pistons in the groove. In each groove, you want to stagger each ring. In other words, you're going to want one of the gaps here, one of the gaps over here, one over here. You don't want any of them to line up, so you want to line all these gaps up opposite of each other, or just make sure none of the gaps line up. And then once you get all the rings in, next we'll install the rod bearings. I go in down here, install the rod bearings, then we'll install the rod and piston assembly into the engine. Okay, once you have all your rings on the piston and they're all staggered, you're going to want to take your ring compressor, slide it down on the piston, and then tighten it up so it compresses the rings so we can install it into the engine. Basically just like we did our main bearings, we're going to take our rod bearings and install them into our piston rod. One's going to go on the rod, and one is going to go on the end cap. We'll put a bearing in here on the end cap and a bearing in the rod, just like you did in the mains. They have a little notch right here that lines up with the indentation on the rod. Line those up, spin the bearing in. Same thing on the rod cap. Has an indentation right there. You slide the bearing into it. So this notch, this tit on the bearing right there will line up with the indentation on the rod cap. So install both your bearings, your rod bearings, and then we will plastic gauge and measure the oil clearance for the rod bearings. once we install the piston into the cylinder. Alright, once you have your ring compressor installed on your piston, so you want to lube your cylinder up with oil, and also you want to lube the end of your or lube your bearing up also with some oil. Make sure you keep everything as clean as possible when you're doing this step, or actually any of these steps. Keep your engine as clean as possible. You want to carefully slide the piston into the cylinder. Make sure you have it facing the right direction. Make sure your rod is going in the same way it came out when you installed it. And of course, you should mark everything. Mark your rods, end caps, rod caps, and all that. And bearing caps, if they are not marked already, mark them before you pull it apart. Once you get your piston in there with the ring compressor, gently tap on the piston as it goes into the cylinder. So I'm going to do this. Basically, you need 2 hands. Install that like that. Push it all the way in until it goes all the way in. And then install your rod cap. And then we're going to check the oil clearance on the rod cap. Okay, on your rod cap, you want to keep that dry with no oil. It's a little blurry here, I don't know why. Take and put a piece of the plastic gauge onto the end cap. See if I can find this plastic gauge that I just cut. Okay, here it is right here. You're going to take your plastic gauge, lay it on your rod bearing. Get it positioned on your rod bearing. Like that. You can see the plastic gauge on the rod bearing. Once it's on the rod bearing, we're going to install the rod cap and torque it to specs. I've installed the rod cap already. I torqued it to specs. I'm taking the rod cap back off, and do this for each one. Each piston, each rod, each bearing, you want to check the clearance on it. And this one you can clearly see the plastic gauge, once it has been tightened to the torque it's supposed to be tightened to. You can see how it smushes the plastic gauge. Kind of hard to see. There it is on the main journal, or on the rod journal. That's what you're going to want to measure with your plastic gauge clearance chart. So basically, you will take your plastic gauge and measure you'll take your ruler that they give you, or their clearance sheet, and measure the plastic gauge when it is smushed down. It's really hard to get a good picture of it, but if you can see that, you'll want to measure it with the paper they give you once the plastic gauge is smushed down, and it gives you all the different clearances like I showed you before, from 1 to 3/1000 on this one. Measure each rod journal, or each bearing, each rod bearing, and make sure that you have the correct clearance on each one. Alright, we have measured our bearing clearance on the rod journals, and now we're ready to install our end cap. Make sure you line up the end cap the way it's supposed to go, where the numbers match each other. Flashlight real quick. If you can see this, you can see where the numbers are on the rod journal. Maybe you can. You'll see a 2 and a 2. Number 2 rod, number 2 piston. Those are the marks you want to be sure that are lined up. Next, you're going to want to torque it down. Started, and we will switch to torque wrench. Torque each one to the proper torque. Make sure you oil your rod bearings before you install it for the last time. Okay, that's torqued down. And what I like to do after I install each piston and connecting rod and bearings is I like to make sure the engine spins over freely with each one that I install. So you just want to crank it over and make sure that it spins over easy. That one spins over real nice. So just make sure she spins over easy once you install each rod. Next thing I'm going to do is install the timing gear inner plate. And is it down here? I like to use some high temp silicone just to cover the imperfections in the metal, especially where there's been rust and pits, stuff like that. This one's going to be a little bit trickier because these two studs right here and here are pretty much seized in the block, so it's going to be a little bit trickier to go on than normal. So basically, I'm going to lift the plate up in place. When you do so, you have to, a little trickier than I thought here. When you do so, because of the studs, you're going to have to kind of go around the cam here. Right here is the cam. You have to go around the cam to get the plate to go on correctly. And that's how it's going to go on, but there are a couple thrust washers that go behind the cam here that are going to have to also be installed. So they basically slide in this groove. It's really hard to see. There's a groove back there that these thrust washers slide into. So we're going to have to install these into the groove while we're putting this plate on. It's going to be a little tough. I'm going to have to put this down, try and get a position where you can see. I don't think I'm going to be able to. See if this will work. Install this washer in the grooves, and hopefully be able to slide this all in at one time. Like so. And then push the whole assembly in at one time. And then washers. Very close. Get a screwdriver, I might be able to get that in there. Okay, oh, almost. This one here. Away. Also, hole that you have to line up. One in, put the one that the hole has to line up. You have to get that position just right. The hole lined up in the plate. There's a hole in the thrust washer and a pin in the block that you have to line up. So it's a little tricky. Close. There she went. Okay. Now that that is in there, we can finish securing the plate to the block. If you look, there is a hole in the thrust washer keeper right there, and it has to line up with a pin. And the pin is actually on the other side. And there's two holes, one in one half, one in the other. One of the halves has to line up with the hole, or the hole has to line up with the pin. So now that that is all in there, I can secure the plate to the engine block. Okay, next we're going to install the timing gears. You got your cam gear, got your idler gear, and you've got your injector pump gear, and then of course your crank gear. So I'm going to get those installed. Once I get them installed, I will show you how they're supposed to line up. Okay, this is the correct timing. Once you get it all together, you can see timing marks on each one. Hopefully you can see it. I'm going to line these marks up. See the dot and the two lines on the crank and idler gear. And you've got two dots in a line. The line's on the idler gear. The two dots is on the gear that connects to the injector pump. And then you've got your idler gear with the two notches and the line on the gear that runs your camshaft. Make sure all those lines are lined up. Make sure you bend these tabs over right here on the lock plate, your idler gear, and also on the back of your injector pump drive shaft. There is a clip back in here also that you have to install. Make sure that you install that clip back there. And that's it. Okay, since the last time we left off, I have assembled pretty much most of the rest of the engine. Put the timing cover on, the water pump, well, both water pumps, fresh circulation pump, and the raw water pump. Also installed the injector pump which is this is just all basic stuff. The injector pump is splined a certain way; it can only go in one way. The oil pump basically just bolts up one way, so all this stuff just basically bolts up one way. Nothing really special about it, but the engine is pretty much lower end is all together. And what I'm working on now is installing the valve guides in the head. I've installed most of them. 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, number 8, you can see that I'm installing it. I use a valve guide driver to install the valve guides, and they have an installed height of 895 thousandths. So basically, just take your mic, your calipers, whatever you want to call them, and get you an installed height from the top of the guide to the deck of the head. Install all the guides at the same height, and we'll continue later. Alright, when we left off, we installed our valve stem, or valve guides. We installed our valve guides. Next, we're going to check our valve stem height before we cut our valve seats. Get your dial calipers out and check your valve stem height. Once you get your reading, you want to save that reading. This one here is right at about 2 inches. Exactly 2 inches. So our valve stem height, installed height, is 2 inches before we cut our seat. So what we want to do after we cut our seat, we're going to want to measure that valve stem height again, and say it's we'll say it's 2 inches 20 thousandths, or 2 inches 10 thousandths. If it's 2 inches 10 thousandths, you want to put shims up under your spring collar, so you will get the same spring pressure as you would have before you cut your seat. So now that we have done that, we have a reading. Make sure you save it. I'm going to flip the head over, and I've already cut most of the seats. So I'm going to cut this last one here. We're going to use our 45. And first, let me tell you, I use a New Way cutter set. You can use stones if you want. I like the New Way cutter set. You have a 31 degree, a 46 degree, and a 60 degree. See if you can see it here. But there's arrows on the cutter that tell you which direction for the different angle. That one looks like a 31, so if you flip it over, this would be your 46 here. Almost upside down, but that's your 46. And this is your 60 degree cutter. Basically, you want to cut your 46 degrees cut first. So you're going to take that, you're going to cut that 46 degree cut. Usually doesn't take a whole lot unless they're really pitted. The seats are really pitted, and it takes a while to make your cut. quite ready yet, so I'll keep cutting. Basically, you just want to check the seat, make sure there's no pits in it. Once it's clear of all pits, then your 46-degree cut is finished. Next, you're going to want to cut your 31-degree, which is going to lower. I find you usually have to lower the seat for the valve contact to be correct. So you either want the valve contact to be in the center of your valve or the lower 2/3 of your valve for the contact surface. If you get it too high, the valve can tool up on you. So next we're going to cut the 31-degree cut and lower our seat. So I'm going to keep cutting this a little bit. 31 usually takes a little bit longer, and I'll be right back with you. Okay, we finished cutting our 31-degree cut. It's really hard to see the different angle cut. I don't know if you're going to be able to see it or not. That's probably not going to help any. But anyways, we cut our 31-degree cut. We have our 46 and our 31. The seat looks really nice, nice and square. That's the important thing about when you install your guide. You want to try and get them installed square so the seat cuts evenly. So next we're just going to take our 60-degree cutter. And this one, you just bury a little bit out of it. All you're doing here is basically narrowing your seat contact. All you usually need for a 60-degree cut. Yeah, let me take a look at that real quick. Pull our guide out. Looking at it. It looks pretty good. I want to narrow the seat up just a little bit more. Basically, I don't know if you can see the other one over here that I cut. Kind of hard to see the cut, and it really is hard to see the width of the seat, the contact area. So like I said, we're going to cut this one a little bit more with the 60, narrow the seat. That should do it. Take a look at this. Okay, that's looking pretty good there. Yep. Okay, we're going to go with that. And way to find out if it's where you want it is to take your valve, run it down in there, and make it seat properly. A couple more times. Put this down for a minute. I'll be right back. I'm going to contact that valve a couple more times. Basically, now you can see the valve. You'll see that contact. See the line around it. Make sure the line goes all the way around the valve. And it's either in the middle or the lower 2/3 of the valve. And that's it. That's how you cut the seats. Once you go to install it, remember, just install your shims up underneath your spring collars. Get your spring tension correct. So all these seats are now cut. The next thing we will do is assemble it. Okay, here we have the head almost all together. We have all the springs on. Keepers except for the one. If I want to leave it apart, just show you the intake valve gets the O-ring seal on it. The exhaust valves do not get any seals. So once you have your seals on all of your intake valves, O-ring seals, take your ring compressor, which is an old one that I have. They make a lot nicer and easier ones to use than that one. But take your spring compressor, put your valve spring on, install your keepers, and you should be good to go. You can test them by tapping the tip of the valve with a hammer and make sure that the keepers are seated correctly and they don't come apart on you. That's about it. Next we will install the cylinder head. Okay, when you're going to install your cylinder head, check the gasket, check your head gasket. Some of them can be installed either way, some of them cannot. This one plainly says top front on the corner. I don't know if you can see that or not. So that'll face up and that'll go towards the front of the engine. Like so. Once the gasket is in place, you lay your head on, and then you can torque the cylinder head to the specific torque and sequence. I usually, if there's no sequence available, if I can't find it or whatever, I usually start from the inside and work my way out. So you'd start with these two first, and then work your way out. Those two, these two, these two, these two, these two, and so on. Torque it to the correct specs. I usually start at 5 or 10 pounds and then work my way up at 5-pound increments. I'm kind of picky about it. I usually do that. Some people don't. Some people start at 20 pounds and then 40 and then 60 or whatever. I like to make sure that my cylinder is torqued as flush as possible. So anyways, go ahead and we can stick our cylinder head on now. I'll be right back. Okay, I just got done installing all the push rods. After I torqued the head down, the head's all torqued down. And I installed my push rods. And there's all the push rods installed. After that, I adjusted my valve lash for each valve. Let's see if I can find one that's valve's closed. That one's closed. Just want a slight drag there when you adjust it. You adjust it by loosening this lock nut and turning the set screw right there. This set screw is slotted if you want to use a screwdriver. Once you get your valves adjusted, of course you want to do each one individually. Make sure that your tappet that rides on your push rod, make sure it's at its lowest point on the lobe of your camshaft, and then you want to adjust your push rod accordingly, your valve lash, get it correct. Once I adjust them, as I do each one, I like to spin the engine over, make sure that everything turns easily, there's no binding, and everything works as it should. So we're done pretty much with the internals of the engine. So you want to make sure it spins over freely, everything works correctly, and then we'll move on to installing the outer parts of the engine, and that's it. Alright, we've completed the Perkins 4108. This one's installed in a sailboat, and as you can hear, have it running right now. I went ahead and installed all the other outer parts, the starter, the alternators, valve cover, intake manifold, and all that stuff. Just basic bolting, that kind of stuff on. And as you can hear, it sounds good, running good. We have it dry docked right now, so we have a water supply line going down to the ball valve right now, and it's actually supplying the engine with water from the dry dock. Over here we have a 75 amp alternator that's charging his start batteries, and down here we have a 150 amp alternator that's charging his house batteries. Over here you can see his manual temperature gauge starting to heat up. It's been running for, oh, I don't know, 5 minutes. It's about 40 degrees out today, so it's a little chilly. Other than that, everything seems to sound good. It's running good, so everything's done. Job's complete.